Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. As we're getting ready to head into Q4 or the holiday season, I'm going to do as I do every single year and start giving you guys some recommended buyer's guides, if you will. And today we're going to be getting a head start on a proper buying guide for sim pilots who are looking hard at the Pimax Crystal lineup. Today we are doing a true one-to-one Pimax Crystal Lite versus the Pimax Crystal Super. They're two, I would say, flagships, if you will, and I'm calling both of them a flagship because it really depends on who's going after it. Today I'm going to spell out what's the difference, what makes one on the lower end, mid-range, and high-end PCs, and where the extra money actually buys you something you'll see in the cockpit. So stick around. If you are interested in any of my tutorial guides for Microsoft Flight Simulator, or simply interested in supporting the channel, consider joining me on Patreon. Patreon subscribers level tier 2 and above have access to all of my guides as well as any future guides that come down the road. Patreon link can be found in the description below. Okay, before we get into this, I want to remind everyone this is not a sponsored segment. This isn't a sales pitch or a hype piece. Both headsets have real strengths and both have some pretty significant trade-offs. It really depends on where you're at. I'm going to call out those like I always do on the channel so you can make a smart decision and hopefully not regret it come January. I know there's already been some frustrating points of certain buyers depending on which model they grabbed, so I'm hoping this will help save some of that. I know with the holiday season coming up, everyone wants to get them, their loved ones and friends and even themselves, that very expensive gift that they've really been after, and I know VR is becoming far more popular and is definitely on the list. So let's start talking about the breakdown between the two devices in a quick high-level overview. First off, the Crystal Lite has a very sharp image for the price, rocking at 120Hz option just like the rest of them, in a simple setup for seated simulation. However, it doesn't have any eye tracking and it has fixed foveation. It is the sensible pick, however, for most sim rigs that aren't packing the absolute top tier of GPUs, CPUs, and the highest set of RAM. And we're going to talk more about that here later on. But that is something that you want to be considering. We talk a lot about GPUs, and unfortunately the game doesn't end there. GPUs don't mean anything if your CPU isn't fast enough to deliver the information to the GPU to make it worthwhile. And of course, RAM quantity isn't as critical as RAM speed, but doesn't play as big of a part into this decision as much as CPU and GPU does. A GPU definitely is the top bang of the VR world, but don't forget that a GPU is only as good as the delivery system, which is your CPU. Now, the Crystal Super has a much higher pixel density, a wider field of view options, has eye tracking with dynamic foveated rendering, and auto IPD. Because of the eye tracking again. It is the pinnacle option if you have the monster setup. The Super really starts to make sense on 90 series cards in my personal opinion. The RTX 4090 and the RTX 5090. Don't worry too much about the 50 series versus the 40 series in the aspect that the 50 series really just brings multi-frame generation versus standard frame generation, and frame generation in VR doesn't mean a damn thing. It doesn't do anything. So, however, things to take into consideration that we will talk about later on is DLSS does make a difference. So we're going to assume for these videos that, or for the next few minutes of this video, that DLSS is being used because it is a very, very handy feature for virtual reality, even on top tier heads or top tier systems. So now let's talk about the why I pick one versus the other. Here's a big differentiator. The Lite does not have eye tracking. It uses fixed foveation, so your GPU renders everything more uniformly. The Super has 120Hz eye tracking plus an automatic IPD. For those who don't know, that's interpupillary distance, or the distance basically between the center of your eyes from one to the other. This is a crucial configuration as it determines where the quote-unquote sweet spot is in the virtual reality headset. You want the sweet spot, again, quote-unquote, to be at that center of your eyes. That way, wherever your eyes are looking is the clearest of point. And that unlocks the dynamic foveated rendering, having that eye tracking and automatic IPD. In translation, the place you look is rendered at full fidelity while the peripheral can step down subtly. In practice, that can claw back performance in most GPUs or most GPU punishing scenes. Dense clouds, complex airports, heavy add-ons, glass cockpits. If your frame time budget is limited by the pixels you're pushing. So again, this is where the lower end GPUs or mid-range GPUs start to really take advantage of this. And this is where the Super isn't necessarily restricted to those, unlike, for example, myself, the 4080. I can still absolutely get a wonderful experience out of it, but just not to its full capability. The eye tracking also makes setup a bit friendlier. Auto IPD tends to land you in the optical sweet spot, as we talked about before, without fiddling around too much. However, to be clear on the both versions of the headset, if you know your IPD, which any optometrist should be able to tell you, for example, if you have already prescription lenses or eye contacts, there's a good chance that on your prescription your IPD may already be listed, but if not, your optometrist probably knows what it is. And if you get that exact number, well, the auto IPD isn't quite as critical of a feature anymore. But that is something that you have to take into consideration nonetheless. Now, both headsets can take advantage of mini LED local dimming QLED engines, but the Super zone count is significantly higher. So in this, the sim shows up, especially at night, you get a much bigger stack. You get darker blacks and better contrast separation. It's not OLED black, that's now another module, however, but we're not going to discuss that in detail in this particular video as it is an extra cost. So it's not OLED, but it is significantly better than the Edge lit. If you fly a lot of night ops, or you love the look of towering clouds at sunset, you'll notice this definitely on the Super. On the Lite, local dimming is still a very nice upgrade when you get the LD version. It gives you most of the benefit with just fewer zones. So again, not quite the clarity and not quite the depth of coloring that you're going to get with the Super. However, if you have never used a headset or you're coming from a lower headset, for example, like the Oculus, if you were coming from any other version of headset and you go to the Lite, I promise you're not going to be disappointed as far as the coloring goes, or even the depth of field. Again, it is absolutely a nice feature on the Super, but I want you to again be thinking about if your system can handle it. Now, both headsets are definitely on the heavier side compared to the ultralight pancake lenses. Again, if you're coming from something like the Oculus, you're gonna notice the weight. The Lite sits right around the mid 800 gram range for the headset, and the Super is even heavier and even more heavier depending on the configuration and audio. Either way, for a seated sim environment, the weight is definitely manageable, and there are comfort kits, one of which I will be reviewing here on the channel next week, or possibly actually over the next couple of days. But you can use different counterweights and battery packs that are third party, not for power purposes, but simply merely for the idea of adding some weight to the back that helps balance the front. But again, if you're going custom. I don't recommend the battery pack, but I've seen it done, so I figured I would mention it here. But anything that will balance the weight back towards the back versus on the front. Going into the comfort kit that we are going to be reviewing here on the channel, this is one of the things that it offers, and that's a thicker facial interface to spread the pressure off the cheekbones or on the cheekbones instead of on the forehead or on your nose. That is probably my biggest complaint about both headsets, is that it does sit on my nose, and depending on if you're an Italian schnoz holder like me, you may have a problem there. But again, there are ways around it. Tighten it for stability, not tightness to secure the strap on your head. Okay, so you want to keep it stable, but you don't want to lock the thing down like you're holding the Titanic in place. It's not necessarily that critical. It's more about adjusting the strap. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention that I notice is done wrong very often is you want to make sure the strap, and this is pretty much true with any VR, but you want to make sure that the strap is towards the bottom of your skull and not at the 90-degree line parallel to your forehead. The back strap needs to go under underneath the base of your skull so it supports that forward weight a bit better, and that will make it more comfortable. So as silly as this sounds, do make sure that you are actually wearing the headset correctly, because that's going to have an impact with either one that you buy. So now let's get into tracking. Tracking inside out on both with the optional Lighthouse is available. Lighthouse I don't necessarily think is a requirement much anymore, although I'm going to mention this as I have heard of some who still have issues with the inside out tracking. Inside out tracking essentially doesn't require any kind of third set of hardware. Again, the lighthouses that track the positions of the headset. It uses cameras on the outside of the VR headset to track its position and orientation. So you basically gives you that plug and play option essentially for tracking. However, the Lighthouse face mask I have used on the Crystal Light. I did notice a slight improvement, I guess, in tracking. There weren't near as many micro stutters, if you will, in certain movements. But again, that is something that I did not consistently experience to begin with. Especially in a brighter room, or if you were using large screen TVs in front of you like I have. My sim pits have 55-inch TVs in front of them, so that definitely tends to make a bit of a difference. However, if you are in dark lit rooms with smaller screens, you may want to consider the Lighthouse face mask, but again, not a crucial piece in my personal opinion or experience. I have played on both types of monitors and screens. I have played in both light and dark scenarios, and I don't usually have any issue with them. As far as the use of the controllers go, to be completely honest, I can't speak to that as I never use them, like literally ever. For standing play games like that, you know, the games I play with my kids and stuff, I do still use the Oculus. And that's not because of the Oculus necessarily being better than the Crystal for that particular thing. It's just that my Crystal Lights are designed for the sim pits, and I don't have a computer in the living room where I game with my children. So keep that in mind, that there isn't any particular reason other than the lack of PC in the room where I would want to play with my children. So topping off the tracking and stability for a seated sim environment, the inside-out tracking seems to work perfectly well. Now, the one thing that I will say is that it is in the roadmap for the Crystal Super to have the ability to do mixed reality with a mixed reality faceplate. However, there is no timeline or tracking that I'm aware of that brings that to light in our near future. But it is something that I wanted to mention, as it was mentioned early on in the development of the Crystal Super that it was definitely on the roadmap. So cross your fingers it's sooner than later, but at this time of this video, it is not yet available, and I don't have a time frame as to when it will be. Now, getting into the hardware portion, this is where they will start to balance out a little bit. So talking hardware, because this is where people tend to waste the money if they don't plan for it. I'm going to split this up into 3 brackets. Bracket A strong but sane PCs. Think RTX 3070, 4070 class. You can absolutely run the light well here. Tune your OpenXR resolution, which is now built into the Pimax software, by the way. You're going to want to lean on DLSS quality or balanced, and use motion reprojection as needed, although motion reprojection can induce artifacts, so keep that in mind. You're going to want to prioritize clouds and anti-aliasing for readability. And you'll be very happy with that particular setup. I am currently running the Crystal Light on the RTX 5070 Ti, which, to give you comparison, is about 10% slower in raw FPS than the RTX 4080. Okay, so on this class of hardware, the Super will run, but you're going to wind up giving back a lot of that resolution in order to maintain the frame rates, which brings it much closer to that of the resolution you're going to get with the Crystal Light. So you're going to be paying a far higher premium in the aspect of almost $1,000, maybe $1,100 more at times, depending on the time of year, for a headset that, as far as visually speaking, just speaking to the resolution and resolution alone right now, will be significantly closer to that of the Crystal Light. So this is where you have to decide whether or not you're going to want all of those additional features that come with the Crystal Super, because that's really the only place where you're going to be able to pull. You're still going to probably be able to run a slightly higher resolution than that of the Crystal Light, but you're going to be definitely close to it, where if you're not super hooked on those extra features, you may find yourself in a bit of buyer's remorse. So Again, you'll end up lowering the render scale or the settings to the point where the additional PPD isn't pulling its full weight. Again, in my opinion, don't buy the Super for a 3070 or 4070 series and maybe even the 4080, which I have, and we'll talk about that, or you may not get what you paid for. So now let's move into bracket B. Bracket B is going to be high, but not the halo. Think again the RTX 4080, 4080 Super, and or an AMD 7900 XTX. Although be cautious, Team Red, in my opinion, still doesn't quite have the bat necessary for VR, but it can do it. So at this tier, the light is still fantastic, and in my personal opinion, is still the way to go, but I wanted to break this up to be as fair as possible. So it does let you crank the terrain level of detail, clouds, traffic, while keeping things smooth. The Super starts to make sense if you fly very clarity sensitive content, study level cockpits, lots of glass, lots of charts, and you're willing to invest the time dialing in the dynamic foveated rendering, which is going to be critical, as well as reprojection to make that situation great. However, again, if you're not willing to push that weight, the Crystal Light is probably still the way to go. However, you'll still taste the benefit, and it is a conscious trade all the same though. So again, I wanted to put bracket B in here to keep it fair and as balanced as I could, but it still leans towards the Crystal Light in my opinion. Finally, bracket C is the Halo hardware, your RTX 4090s and 5090 class. And again, please keep in mind, CPUs need to be just as powerful. But this is where the Super becomes the right call for the person who wants maximum clarity and a wider field of view. The extra PPD and dynamic foveation actually translate into a real world win because your frame time budget can handle it. If you're shopping in this tier for the holidays and the budget's already there, the Super makes sense here. Okay, because at this point, you've already spent the money on a very high powerful CPU and GPU. You've already got the hardware to push it, so then you might as well get the benefit from spending the money, especially the premium that is still in place when you talk about an RTX 4090 and 5090. When you take into consideration that the average 5090, you could still buy two Crystal Supers for that price of one GPU. So if you're gonna shell out the money for the hardware, you might as well get the VR to take the benefit of it. An important note on frame generation, once again, I wanted to make sure we hit this. DLSS super resolution is helpful in VR. Frame generation doesn't do squat. In the VR context, we fly, for example, Microsoft Flight Simulator and DCS World. Frame generation either isn't supported in VR mode or it adds latency that doesn't fix the fundamental VR smoothness problem. If anything, it actually makes it worse. So to be crystal clear, see what I did there? Boom, psh. You can turn on DLSS, but frame generation doesn't do anything for VR users, okay? So don't count on it as an option to tweak in your GPU settings, thinking that you're gonna catch a benefit from it in virtual reality. This is a common point that I still to this day see people mentioning, thinking that it helps, and it does not, okay? So wanted to make me throw that out there. So now to the buying guide, right? If you're looking to building or upgrading a sane sim rig, so think 12th, 13th, or 14th gen Intel, Ryzen 7 or 9 series, with an RTX 3070 to 4070 level GPUs, the Pimax Crystal Light is your better buy. You get very high clarity, 120 Hz ceiling to tune the smoothness the way you want. You keep your budget left for what actually matters in the sim. You can always upgrade to a better GPU later, better yoke, better pedals, better motion platform if you guys are looking to go that route, which I do recommend in virtual reality. I will say motion platforms in VR specifically really shine. They're also fun on large triple screen setups. The Light definitely earns its reputation as the seated sim value pick in my personal opinion and in my experience using both options. However, as we talked previously, if you're already in that Halo GPU club, that top tier build, the RTX 4090 and 5090, and you want the premium experience for flight, racing, whatever it may be, then the Crystal Super is definitely the move for you. You'll see the higher PPD, you'll feel the wider FOV options, the eye-tracked foveation auto IPD make the experience much cleaner, much easier, much simpler. It's definitely the better headset overall when your hardware can support it. That's the kicker. However, if you're like me and you're on the RTX 4080 class system, you have to ask yourself how much you value the clarity versus the extra settings, as we've already talked about. And that's what I rock as the RTX 4080 as my top tier build, if you will. If you spend most of your time in the study level cockpits and you care deeply about text legibility, the Super may still be worth it. However, I do want to make that very clear that as someone who is farsighted, meaning that I struggle to see things that are far away, the Crystal Super has been absolutely fantastic in any aircraft, or excuse me, back up. The Crystal Light has been absolutely fantastic in every headset and virtual reality experience that I have flown. Whether it be in a general aviation cockpit, a GA glass cockpit, or a Boeing 737 as that is my commercial airliner of choice, or in doing dogfighting in DCS world, I have never had a problem acquiring targets, seeing my gauges, reading my text, and figuring out what it is that I want to do inside of the Crystal Light. I want to make that perfectly clear, but the Super is better. Okay, so the Super may still be worth it if that is an absolute must for you. If you're not more into broad level of detail, traffic, weather, and you want just a dead simple tuning, the Light will feel easier and will still look excellent, as we talked before. If this has helped, give it a like and a share with someone who you know is getting ready to make this expensive purchase. I truly love you guys, and I hope that you take this as the value that I was hoping to deliver. I've never done a video this detailed and deep dived before, so I hope that it met your expectations and gave you the information that's truly going to help you make a buying experience that you'll be happy with. The reason why I do these videos every year is because I too have spent most of my life on a budget. I grew up poor, and I remember what it was like for your last dime to be spent on something that you thought you really wanted, and it turned out to be either for example, when I bought my first Pimax, I did not have a GPU that it was anywhere near powerful enough to run it. And so it literally had to sit there for months until I could save up for one. So that's what these videos are about, is to hopefully spare you some of that heartache and pain, especially given that everything's already as expensive as it is. So as always, folks, stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.